Hi, welcome back to Clarkenomics. In this video, we're going to talk about something very important in the world of inflation called the Consumer Price Index. So, the Consumer Price Index, better known as the CPI, has been calculated since 1913, so over a century now. And it's an index. If you're not familiar with what an index is a statistic, right? It measures a lot of different things and then compiles them into nice one neat number. Indexes or indices are very, very useful because instead of looking at a whole host of data, you can just look at one single number and get a sense of a situation. And in this case, what are we getting a sense of? Well, we're getting a sense of the price level, the prices that consumers pay. That's what the CPI measures, the US price level every month. So if we want to look at inflation, we are looking at changes in the price level, and the CPI is the statistic that, one of these statistics, but one of the main ones that we can turn to say what's going on with prices in the US. Now, this statistic is compiled by a group that we have already talked about in our unemployment related videos called the Bureau of Labor Statistics, better known as the BLS. Now, the way that they calculate the CPI is what's called using a market basket. That's why there's a picture of a basket there. And the way that this works is there's an imaginary basket of things that consumers purchase regularly. Think about the things in your family that you buy all the time. Those are the things that they put into an imaginary basket and they see how much the basket costs. And then the next month, they look at that same basket of goods, more or less, and they see how much the basket costs the next month. And in doing so, they're hopefully able to see what happened to the costs of the things that consumers buy. That's what's called a market basket approach. So this is a breakdown of what's in this basket. Again, it's not a physical basket, it's just an imaginary way of thinking about things consumers buy. They weight the categories of these different things differently because consumers spend more of their money on something like housing, right? So 25% of the CPI basket is what's the cost of housing, whether it's rentals or mortgages, things like that. Food, that's a big one. People spend a lot of money on food. What's happening to the prices of food? Recreation and others, transportation, education costs. That includes college, right? Healthcare costs, communication, clothing and footwear. So those are the 8 different, big categories. There are all kinds of little subcategories within those, but the 8 big categories of the CPI market basket. And again, there are different weights to these things. So if you're wondering, okay, well, what's happened to prices in the United States over history? Well, here's what we have since 1946. The blue line is the Consumer Price Index for urban consumers, all items in the US city average, basically what we call the price level. And you can see that almost always the price level is going up, right? Almost always. So here we are in 2020, and the CPI is just over 240. Now, 240 what? What are we talking about here? What are the units of CPI? Well, there are no units of CPI. It's not something we can say like there's utils or there's dollars, because this is an index. All that matters is comparing to a previous CPI. And so when we have something called a base year, like we did with real GDP, the base year CPI is always 100. So if you look back at this graph that we have here, over here, index 1982 to 1984 equals 100. So the base year, they actually have multiple base years, is an average of the price level between 1982 and 1984, which puts us right about here, right? And if you were to look right there in that range, that would be about 100. So before the base year, the price level was lower than 100, and after the base year, prices are higher than 100. And then the base year, the price level is exactly, the CPI is exactly 100. So when we use the CPI, we're using it to calculate rates of inflation or deflation. Again, inflation is when the price level is rising, money is losing its value, and deflation is when the price level is falling, meaning the money is gaining value. But what we care about is the percentage rate of change. That's what inflation actually is. It's a rate of change in the price level. And to calculate percentage change, it's pretty easy. There's a formula, new minus old divided by old. No, right? N-O-O, new minus old divided by old. So let's do some examples. Okay, calculating inflation rates. In 1948, the CPI was 24.1. In 1987, the CPI was 113.6. So what we're trying to figure out here is, between 1948 and 1987, those years, what was the rate of inflation? Well, let's calculate. Our new value is 113.6. Our old value is 24.1. So 113.6 minus 24.1 divided by 24.1, that's going to give us 89.5. Divide that by 24.1, that's going to give you 3.71. But we do need to turn this into a percentage, right? So if you multiply that by 100, that means that the inflation rate between 1948 and 1987 was 371%, give or take. So what that means in more simple language is, between those years, prices more than tripled. They almost quadrupled. Now again, in the United States, on a yearly basis, inflation is way lower than that, right? We have about 2.5% inflation in the United States in any given year. But we're not looking at just over 1 year, right? We're looking at almost 40 years. And over those 40 years, prices almost quadrupled. So that's how we do it. Now, we can also use this is fascinating, to calculate historical prices within reason. It's not going to be exact because we'll talk about the reasons later. But here's how to figure that one out. You take the year A price, and then you multiply that by the year B CPI divided by the year A CPI. And that's going to give you the year B price. Now that sounds really confusing, so don't put too much stock in that. Let's just go through an example and it'll make way more sense. So let's say a baseball bat cost $50 in 1987. I made up these numbers. How much would it have cost in 1948 dollars? That same bat, if we were to look at it in 1948, how much would it cost? And we're going to say the 1948 CPI, once again, is 24.1, and the 1987 CPI is 113.6. Same numbers as before. So my first question, and this should be your first question when you're doing these types of problems too, is, should the 1948 price be higher or lower? Think about that for a sec. Which price should be higher, 1948 or 1987? Well, the 1987 price should be higher, right? Because the CPI, look at it, is 113. The price level was 113. In 1948, the price level was only 24.1. So the 1948 price should be lower. Because if the CPI has become bigger, that means the price level is higher than it used to be. So your answer needs to be less than 50, right? If you come out with an answer for 1948 that's greater than $50, you did it wrong and you got to go back. So here's what we got to do. We just got to plug it in. So $50 multiplied by the 1948 CPI over the 1987 CPI is going to give you $10.61. So that's your answer. In 1948, that bat would have cost $10.61. We knew the price had to be lower than 50, and it is. If you were to do this incorrectly, mix up your CPIs, that'd be 113.6 divided by 24.1 times 50. That would have given you an answer of $235.68, much higher than 50. And since we know, again, prices in 1948 were lower than they were in 1987, that answer would be very, very wrong. So it's always good to double check yourself like that. So it's pretty easy. You just take the price you know and multiply it by one CPI over the other. Just make sure you put the right one on top and the right one on bottom, and you should have no problems. But just in case, it's always a good thing to be able to prove your answer, to check your work. So we said, 2 slides back, that between 1948 and 1987, there was 371.36% inflation. So what we can do is we can take our answer from the previous slide and use that inflation rate to prove it. So, as we did in a different video, you take the current price, multiply that by 1 plus the decimal inflation rate, and that's going to give you the future price. So, again, we can just swap in our numbers here. If that bat cost $10.61 in 1948, like we said that it did, how much would it cost in 1987? And we know what the answer should be, right? The answer should be $50. Let's see. If you take 10.61 and multiply that by 1 plus 3.7136, that's going to give you $50.01. Did we get it right? We did. I know it's not exactly $50, but that's a rounding error. So That's a good way to check yourself if you're not sure if you're doing things the right way. You could also test your answer by doing 50 divided by that, and that'll reverse the process there. You're just rearranging things algebraically. So that's how to do all these calculations with CPI. But we have to be careful when we use CPI because the CPI is not always going to give you the exact historic price that something actually was, right? You might have used CPI numbers to calculate how much a baseball bat cost in 1948, but if you were to go back and maybe look at a catalog or something like that, you might find that it wasn't $10.61. And that's because the CPI is a national average of the price level in the whole United States. In some places, things cost more, things cost less, things inflate faster, sometimes things deflate. Cities, are a great example of places where prices rise more quickly than they do in more rural, more country areas, right? So there's that. Not only that, CPI is a whole basket of stuff. Some of the things in the basket might inflate faster, some of the things might inflate slower, some of the things in the basket might actually deflate. So, for instance, the cost of college has inflated at a much higher rate than other things over the past, decade and longer. But the price of televisions has actually deflated, right? Televisions are something that have gone down in price recently. So when you look at the CPI number, that's just the whole basket worth of stuff. An index is very useful because it boils everything down into one number, but it has limitations because after all, it is just one number. And not only that, the data itself is, can be flawed, right? Data collection is not perfect. It's just a sample. They don't have prices for every single product in the United States. They just have a market basket of things that people typically buy, and they don't go to every single store in the United States to ask how much things cost. They have some places that they go to. Not only that, this is one of the kind of big things. The items in that basket change over time, right? Because, well, there's a few reasons. There's something called substitution bias. If a good becomes more expensive, people don't just buy the same amount of that good. They buy something else instead. So let's say the price of steak were to rise substantially, and steak is in the market basket. Well, if the price of steak goes up, people might buy more chicken instead, right? And that's going to mean that people buy less of that thing in the market basket. So there's that. There's the idea that culturally, some items are added or dropped. People don't buy the same things as they used to 40 or 50 years ago. Some things hadn't been invented yet. So cell phones were not part of the market basket 50 or 60 years ago, but they are today because, they're around. And not only that, but sometimes items change in quality and change in features. So, televisions are a great example of this. Televisions are much cheaper today than they used to be 30 or 40 years ago. Again, adjusted for inflation. But they do so much more stuff. They're so much better than they used to be. And we're not capturing that necessarily in the market basket. And the BLS does a lot of stuff to account for all of this and to augment, the statistic to make it as accurate as it could possibly be. But there are limitations when you're trying to use the CPI. So this is one of the primary tools that we use to measure inflation in the United States. And thank you for watching.